So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Grand Rounds. Welcome to the Grand Rounds. It is my pleasure to introduce Alfredo Morabia. He is a physician, epidemiology and historian. He holds academic appointment in Queens College and Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University. He has an extensive record publication in epidemiological methods. As you can see, he also has several books. He's going to be talking to us about his latest book. And he also has been funded to extend a work that he had done in the history of epidemiological methods and concepts. So without further ado, I leave you with Alfredo Morabia.
Thank you very much, Luisa, and let me take this opportunity to congratulate you, because I just learned last week that you were chair of epidemiology here, and even though we're in close contact because of the journal, it was something that I had to learn through, indirect sources. So congratulations. And so I'm of course very happy to be here, and I would like to talk to you about this book, because I actually wrote it with a specific, aim, and this was the aim of this book. Is the message is very simple, is that there won't be a huge, population understanding of epidemiologic results if we don't teach epidemiology in middle and high school. And this is the real reason for this book, because I've noticed that actually the essential principle, the most fundamental principle of epidemiology, which is population thinking, to understand that you can learn things from population that you can never learn studying individuals. This concept is something that no one probably, and historically, it confirms it, no one has ever acquired spontaneously. It's totally, unrelated to our normal, ordinary psychological development. It's something that either you discover analyzing population data, or you learn. But it's not something that all of a sudden one morning, or after having received an apple on your head, you will say, that's it, I got it. And so why is this so? And I think that historically we can show that it took a very long time for epidemiology to appear, long time after epidemiology was needed, because this was the main obstacle. And understanding and developing this concept of population thinking. And so let's start from the, more or less the start, the beginning, 40,000 years ago, to see that, you need epidemics to have epidemiology. If there are no epidemics, you don't need the science of epidemics. So it happens that for most, maybe 95% of human history, there were no epidemics. And because during those societies that have been called for raging societies, before the agricultural revolution, etc., the people and society lived in small clans, small groups of people, and they were nomads. And so there was no way a microorganism could survive in a population. The group would either disappear or move away, but there was no way that there would be a recurrence of any form of pathogen. In addition, there's something very important, is that these populations were actually adapted. They had been selected not to be victims of most of the microorganisms that were around us. in order to have epidemics, you needed brand new microorganisms for the human body. I mean, brand new, coming from an area that had not existed before in human history. And this is what occurred more or less 4,000 years before the Common Era in some place that we know well today because it's kind of south of Iraq, right? In this area, for the first time, according to the theory of one historian who died last year, I think, McNeil, they were, for the first time, the conditions for the emergence of epidemics. And according to McNeil, and I haven't seen anyone really criticizing this theory, so I think it quite holds among historians and people who are expert in infectious diseases and even historical infectious diseases. There were two conditions that you see in this fresco from Sumer, in the region of Babylon, and about 4,000 before the Common Era. You need two things for those epidemics to start, and for the need of epidemiology. You need, first of all, enough people. And it's been computed that more or less you need 500,000 people living together in order for measles, for example, to remain in the community and to find regularly new non-immune people to infect so that the microorganisms can subside. So 500,000 people, that's more or less what occurred in Babylon around that time. But you also need the microorganisms. And those microorganisms came from something that had not existed before, which was domesticated animals. And those domesticated animals that you see both here, you see those large domesticated animals, cows and sheep and horses, etc. And all these people together, they created the condition for the adaptation to the human species of brand new microorganisms for which we were not adapted, and who created those huge epidemics and that were part of our history for the last 6,000 years. So at that point, there were epidemics, and so there was a need for epidemiology, right? But there was no epidemiology, and so we can even try to guess how important those epidemics were. This is the only data that I'm aware of, and I actually discovered this by serendipity reading McNeil's book, are Chinese data. And China is a very special area of the world because for about 2,000 years, it has had the same geography, the country has had more or less the same borders and has the same administration. The dominant strata changed with the different invasions, etc., but the structure of the country didn't change much. And so in this country, they had the habit of telling the story of the country itself and of its localities. And so from those stories, it was some scholars were able to abstract the number of huge epidemics that occurred every decades, every century. And what you see here is actually the centuries of the Chinese Empire from -300 to 1900. 1910 is the end of the empire. And in black, you see in the dynastic histories, actually, that were compiled at certain point of moments in time in the 17th century, you see the number of outbreaks, major outbreaks. They had a term for that. They were not quantified how many people they killed, but those outbreaks were reported. And so you see they were pretty rare before the Common Era, and then they've stayed at about 10 per century for about 1,000 years. And all of a sudden, you have this huge, triumphant, emergence and rise of epidemics. To the point that in the 18th, 19th century, there were an outbreak every couple of years, and they were quite generalized. And the interesting thing is that China is also the only place where we have data, continuous data on population size. And this is the red lines, and so the data are fragmentary before the 10th, 11th century. Here we have data. They had reached about 100 million people in the 11th century. There's a trough here because of the Mongolian invasion, and then all of a sudden it goes up and it doesn't stop. And so you have both more epidemics and more people. So clearly the population had adapted to those epidemics. People who survived their to adulthood, they were immune, they could produce, have more children, and the whole thing could continue. And even though there were all those new babies who could be killed by the epidemics, those epidemics essentially killed people who were unproductive and who could not yet reproduce themselves. So you have this big explosion. But this lasts 1,000 years. And where were the doctors? There's not a single indication of an obstacle put to this progression of epidemics over 1,000 years. There's not a single indication. And clearly, people didn't know how to control them, didn't understand what they were, how they came, where they came from, and how to control them. And you could say, well, they didn't have antibiotics, something like that. But it's not that complicated. I mean, there are very basic hygienic means and very simple ways, technologically to actually control them. And we have elements, also historical elements, that show them in other parts of the world, like Central America. So they could have controlled them. They even knew how to control smallpox, because they knew since then that if people caught artificially smallpox, they would not get it again. And so there were some ideas of inoculation of smallpox. So it was not that the problem. The problem is that they didn't understand how to study those phenomena, because you cannot understand epidemics when you study individuals. At the clinical, your clinical experience doesn't give you any clue on what can cause those phenomena and how to eventually control them. So things changed finally in the 17th century. So just as a digression, when you hear that there was, epidemiology in the Bible or anything else before 17th century, I've looked at all those claims, etc. They are mostly religious documents and good faith, but there's nothing like scientific understanding of how you can actually identify the etiology of some epidemic disorders. So what changed in the 17th century? Something crucial: data. All of a sudden, in the 17th century, do you hear me well, by the way, in the back? There is data. And there is data for a specific reason in specific places, and this is London in the 17th century, a city with lots of merchants, great industrial, mercantile activity, and a huge problem with the plague. The plague had become, after the 14th century, the greatest public health enemy. When there was a plague epidemic, people were escaping the city. They were leaving the city to the poor, and the marginals, etc. And so there were theft and etc. And so it was kind of a chaos. Each time there was an outbreak of plague, and the king had to take out his army as soon as possible in order to save its soldiers. So no one was left but the one who couldn't actually get out of the city, and so it had become quite a destabilizing political phenomenon. So the king decided to ask its kind of health department, which was then the church, to actually record all deaths from plagues. And so they knew that when there were no cases in the poor parts of the city, there was no outbreak. It was not an issue. But when an outbreak was coming, then the numbers were going up, and this was the time to organize the retreat. So that's where they started to collect data. And they had every week, one of those bills was posted for those who could read two things: read letters, which was okay, but read numbers, which was very, very rare then, and so that people could follow what was happening. And in 1662, John Grant, who was a rich merchant, and not for nothing, only a rich merchant could read and analyze this amount of data, wrote this book, The Natural and Political Observations made upon the Bills of Mortality, where he actually sets the basis, the foundation of what we use now in every population-based sciences. He actually described for the first time what population thinking is. And how did he get there? The highest point of my last year for me was that picture. It was, the greatest discovery. I mean, it made me so happy. This is a painting from 1660, 1655, something like that, that had been covered by another painting. They had done another portrait by painting over this portrait, and everybody thought it was someone else, but it was not that someone else. And maybe this is John Grant. And there are good reasons to believe it, and some serious historians believe that. And I think John Grant probably must have looked like that. He was young, this is more or less at the time he wrote his book. He was kind of unconventional. You see, he doesn't wear his hair powder. He just leave them on his shoulder. He probably must have attached them in the back when he looked at the bills of mortality. And he actually looked at 50 years of weekly bills. That's, 2,500 pages in the 17th century. No computer, no eraser, ink and feather, and he worked on this data. And there is this very interesting part of the painting. There's this lady, and this lady cannot be his wife because she's actually revealing too much to be his wife. And a court lady, I don't think either, but maybe an allegory of knowledge, or maybe the earliest allegory we know of epidemiology. Who knows? Anyway, so in this book, Grant produced this table, and it's actually a facsimile of it. It's the actual table. It's a picture of the table from his book, which you had to open. Don't buy Grant's book that is sold currently in Amazon, because they actually photocopied it, and this most important part is photocopied, with the rest, and so you only see the page folded. You had to unfold the page to see this first ever table that has number in it. And this is how John Grant discovered population thinking. He discovered something that was actually totally unexpected to anyone that had never looked at data until then. Let's take this here. This is consumption and cough. So this is more or less tuberculosis. And so what what grounds these is that those are years. Okay? In that year, I don't know which year it was, like maybe 16, 20 or something like that, 2,000 deaths from tuberculosis. The next year, 2,000 deaths from tuberculosis. The following year, 2,000 deaths from tuberculosis. Tell me the number of deaths from tuberculosis this year, I tell you the number of deaths of tuberculosis next year. How is this possible? How is this possible? Even today, you will have a hard time explaining to me why every year there is the same number of deaths from tuberculosis in London or here. How can we predict from year to year an event that looks so random? If I think of who's going to die next year, how can I know? Totally unpredictable. But when I looked at population data, I can tell. And this is the birth of population thinking. When you study population, you have actually predictable groups that you can compare, that you can learn from, and you can learn things that no study of individual people can actually ever reveal. And he saw that regularity in some diseases like tuberculosis, and the total irregularity of another disease, which was plague. Plague, you could have 0 death, 2 death, 0 death, and then all of a sudden, 10,000, okay? And so it would then go down, etc. So he said and concluded that probably there were 2 types of diseases, those that were inside of the city that reflected the health of the population, like plague, like tuberculosis. They were always there, and you could predict their occurrence. And other, which probably came from outside. And when they came into the city, they would produce outbreaks, and then they would be eliminated again. And this conclusion was very true for the plague, and it actually reinforced for the first time very seriously the quarantine aspect, protection of the city from incoming people suffering from the plague from outside. And 1662 is the book. 1665 is the last outbreak of plague in London. After that, plague never recurred, and it occurred some few times again in Europe, but 1720 was the last plague in Marseille, in France, and this was over for the plague. So I could tell you a lot of other things about ground. This book is fantastic. I mean, he finally answers lots of questions that people had, and he was the only one who could do that because he had access to data. And he also generated the first life table that we know about that has remained the table until the 19th century. So that was it. 17th century, not only epidemiology, but biostatistics. Every discipline that uses population as its unit had its foundation established and would develop from there. And since then, what I'd like to show you is that this approach has been valid for public health issues and for clinical issues. And it's more the application of this population thinking and group comparison to main clinical and public health issues that have characterized epidemiology since then. The first is, the 18th century, it's the issue of smallpox. When the plague was over, the other main killer was smallpox. It was a terrible disease. Actually, everybody got smallpox when they were young, and it left very terrible scars, sometimes blindness, etc. But it has one main drawback for society. It didn't kill only poor; it also killed rich people. So that was unacceptable, right? And here you have Carlos Baltazar, the only son of Philip IV of Spain. He died of smallpox, and this was the end of the dynasty. And this man, if we had more time, I would ask you who he is, but he's Louis the 15th, okay, that just preceded Louis the 16th, who was beheaded by the French Revolution, and he also died of smallpox. And this young lady, luckily didn't die of smallpox. She's Lady Montagu. And this young lady was the wife of the ambassador of the United Kingdom in Turkey, in Istanbul, and she found out that there was a folk practice consisting of inoculated young children with smallpox. They had a small fever and things like that, but then they were protected for all their life. She inoculated her 2 kids, and the third kept it uninoculated, went back to London and had it inoculated in front of the princess and several doctors. So it was a scandal, I mean, how can people in Turkey know better about smallpox than we do, right? I mean, what's this? You're going to inject, this smallpox material in the body is going to, unbalance all the equilibrium and create more disease, and it's probably worse than getting the normal, the natural smallpox. So that was an epidemiology question: which kills most? Is it artificial or is it natural smallpox? And this question was answered by someone that is a proto-epidemiologist. Several scientists worked on that question, but James Durin got the final answer in 1721. He derived the mortality from natural smallpox from the bills of mortality in a very smart way. I won't go into detail, but he needed to know the mortality from artificial smallpox. So what did he do? He sent a survey. He sent a letter to all the doctors in the country, in the UK and in America, because that was part of it then, as you remember. And he asked all those doctors, tell me how many inoculations you did and how many deaths you counted. And he received those answers, and he was the secretary of the Royal Society, published his results. Mortality from natural smallpox, 10%. Natural mortality from inoculated smallpox, 1%. That was it. And it's been an incredible success, because there have been some people develop a business of smallpox inoculation. The smallpox hospital developed in all the UK, and they actually contributed very strongly to the decline of smallpox. And this is almost a century before the introduction of the vaccine by Jenner at the end of the 18th century. And this has had implication up to here. I won't, ask you who that man is, because I don't want to hurt you, but what happened is that in America, the country was not immune to smallpox. The conditions were totally different than what there was in the UK. Every English soldier was immune. He could carry the disease with them, but they would not kill a regiment, because the herd immunity was too strong. But the Continental Army has no herd immunity, no immunity. And so each time there was a confrontation between the English and the Continental Army, the whole regiments could disappear because of smallpox. And so George Washington had tried to convince the Army and the Continental Congress to actually adopt inoculation for the Continental Army. But there was a huge opposition, because this was defying providence. If God wanted our soldier to die of smallpox, that was his decision, and we should not interfere. The thing is that Benjamin Franklin had lost one son of smallpox. He had been in Europe, he knew all the story, and finally the situation apparently was critical. And at the last minute, George Washington obtained that the Congress actually accepted that every soldier would be inoculated. And this was the moment at which, you know, the situation between the Continental Army and the English Army changed. And some very serious historians say that had the Congress taken this decision a few months earlier, Canada would still be in the Union. Okay. So, because, you know, some of the regiments, you know, had left to defend what is today Canada, and they actually were entirely decimated by smallpox, and it was too late to actually. Anyway, this was smallpox. The other, you know, huge contribution of epidemiology in the 18th century is James Lind and scurvy, and I'm sure you're familiar with the story of you know, the boat and the 12 seamen, 6 pairs. He gave them a different treatment to each of the pair, and found out that those who had received oranges and lemons actually were the only one who got cured from all the other treatment didn't work. So this is another episode, but essentially there have been, you know, some application of epidemiology in the 18th century, but not too much. The real development of epidemiology is in the 19th century. And one of the reasons is that population could have been quite an abstract concept before the development of cities. You know, when the population is spread in the countryside, etc., you don't see it. You know, in England you could see it because it was, you know, London had this concentration of people. They had a parliament. I mean, the population was a political entity, but you know, the rest, most of the other places, it was not like that. In the 19th century, it's completely different. There is the huge development of cities. And contrary to what people think, it's been a great century. Actually, the 19th century has been the century of development, improvement, growth of health improvement, growth of population, and many aspects. We have the vision of you know, David Copperfield and Dickens stories and New York. What was the gangs of New York, etc. But it was part of that story. But it was also a century of huge development in terms of wealth and health, and especially population, you know, became totally visible. And this, you all know this painting by Delacroix, but it really, you know, exemplifies what is a population. Because if you look at, this is a Swiss Guard, I won't talk about that guy, but this is a soldier, this is a worker, you know, because of his dress. This is probably, you know, someone who's much more bourgeois, maybe a student. This is a peasant, this is an urchin, this is a lady, you know, quite armed, but not really dressed for the fight. But so when you put them all, you know, you look at each of them, what can you learn? But still together, you know, they represent a social and political entity which changed the organization of their society and the political structure, etc. So as a group, it has an identity that is different from the identity of each of its members. So that's a population, and it's present, it's obvious, and many disciplines will develop from there. There will be, you know, whether you think of Darwinian biology, that's population thinking, you know, species that follow each other. when you think of Marxism, it's entirely population thinking. The main concepts of political economy are based on population thinking, and sociology and statistics and epidemiology. So in the 19th century, the main public health and clinical problem is fevers. Fevers are everywhere, like today we have cancer or cardiovascular disease. There are all types of fevers, and so since we don't know they're actually the microorganisms, they are not identified. Lots of people think they are due to air pollution, etc. Most of the work of epidemiologists is going to be around controlling or treating fevers. Here you have Pierre-Louis, who actually showed using group comparison in hospital that bloodletting did not work to treat pneumonia. Here you have Ignaz Semmelweis, who compared two wards, one by managed by doctors, the other by midwives, and showed that actually doctors were carrying something in their hands when they moved from the autopsy room to the delivery room. These were group comparison, of course, John Snow. And this is the 19th century. It's quite interesting because all those, huge successes, even though they had no public impact, no one followed none of those results, but they were actually correct. They were obtained with very simple methods. Those were survey, cross-sectional analysis, and that was all that was needed, because most of these diseases, infectious diseases, they killed in a very few days, so you didn't need long follow-up, etc. Things changed in the 20th century. 20th century, the first thing that we see is that all those rapidly killing diseases, measles and diphtheria and cholera, which had, disappeared. They were very important and progressively, for different reasons, hygiene and treatment and vaccines, etc., disappeared. But other diseases became much more important, and they were of a chronic type, like cancer and cardiovascular disease, very rare actually in the 19th, and before that, they became the main public health and clinical problems. And here you see the decline of tuberculosis, which symbolizes the decline of infectious diseases. But tuberculosis was also a chronic disease, and it had been very little studied before the 20th century. What happened with those diseases that you couldn't use a survey to study them. The exposure was here and the disease was there, and a survey would not give you any information. You needed new designs. And that's where those new designs appear. Wilhelm Weinberg wanted to know whether tuberculosis had some hereditary causes, and actually designed the first large cohort study. He followed actually for 20 years, 20,000 people in Germany. An incredible achievement. And he found out that no, there were probably no hereditary causes, but they were more likely social. And since these were the time of eugenic and racial hygiene in Germany, said instead of eliminating the poor, we'd better try to reduce their poverties and things like that. A very interesting work, and this is also someone else who worked on tuberculosis, did cohort studies, but also case control studies of other diseases. This is Wade Hampton Frost, the first professor of epidemiology in the United States, Johns Hopkins, and when he was promoted professor there, he didn't know was epidemiology exactly. He was a public health officer, used to control outbreaks, so he had to make it all. And actually, I went to Hopkins 70 years later, and it was still exactly what he had done that we were doing. So a very influential person. And here, finally, I see a sign of relief. Finally, a lady in my presentation. Yes, this is Janet Lane Clapham, and in 1926, she reported the first case control study. And a very creative person. She done first methodological development in different area, and she's had to study what were the causes of breast cancer, and in particular whether breastfeeding was a cause of breast cancer, because there was this idea that the lesion on the breast caused by the baby, would actually, those traumas would actually later develop into cancer. And her study found most of the risk factors, mostly reproductive risk factors we know today of. So I'm going to go now a little bit faster because you know the rest of the story. But in 1950, there's a new step in the development of epi methods, because there's been this epidemic of lung cancer, huge epidemic. I have to imagine something similar to the AIDS epidemic, an enormous epidemic, so it attracted immediate attention. And in 1950, there were 5 case control studies that reported an association between smoking and lung cancer. But those studies had lots of problems. And actually, the main statistician of that time, whether it is Fisher or Joe Bergson at the Mayo Clinic or Jerzy Neiman at UCLA, they trashed those studies. They trashed the studies, even though in 53 they were the first result of the cohort study, the British doctor study. Those were trashed too. There was selection bias. It didn't fit with the design of experiment as Fisher had said it. And it took, actually, in 1953, there were all the evidence showing that tobacco caused lung cancer. It took another 10 years to actually get a consensus on that. And this was this famous Surgeon General report in 1963. And one of the reasons was there was no textbook of epi methods. There was nothing on methods. And the first textbook actually was published in 1960 by Brian McMahon, who was the chair at Harvard. And this was the first text in which you could learn how to design a study and do things like that. So after this, there's been a huge development in epidemiology. And in particular, it has attracted lots of young people. It was in the 60s. Lots of people felt epidemiology, I'm interested in quantitative methods, but epidemiology is the science, that makes changes. It has a public health impact. So people moved into that, and they were much more, I would say, statistically and quantitatively oriented than the older epidemiologists. And in a few years, this is 1976, is a paper by Olli Miettinen. The discipline had a full theory that was entirely mathematical, entirely. I mean, all of epidemiology is in this graph. I won't explain it to you, but it's possible as it was seen then. And for Miettinen, there were 2 fundamental variables. There were person and times. I said physics has space and time, and we have person and time, right? So this was the science, and very few people understood it until 1986 when Ken Rothman published his first textbook called Modern Epidemiology. And we all thought, that's it, we have our textbook. But in 1980 came the AIDS epidemic, and it didn't work. I mean, that was the 1981, 1983, 2-3 years during which the cause of the AIDS epidemic was unknown. Virologists had not found it. And epidemiologists were totally lost. They looked in area, where chronic epidemiology had been strong, hormones, environmental exposures and things like that, and they didn't look into an infectious cause. But what happened is that all of epidemiologic methods until then had a very well-defined exposure, well-defined outcome, and so we were relating both. And all of a sudden, here you have an exposure that changes across time, an outcome that changes across time, and we needed new methods. And that's where, those causal models that you are learning today were developed, because that's the only way to take into consideration time-varying factors, whether it's the exposure, the outcome, or the covariance. So just to tell you that all these developments, methodologically, they've been tremendous, and they led to very complicated techniques, but this is not the main problem we have. The main problem is that this fundamental difficulty that the public has with epidemiology has not changed. We can learn those things, but for the public to understand what we're doing, they have to understand what's population thinking and group comparison, because whatever we do, how sophisticated we develop our method, they are based on those two essential principles. So we have new problems now to address, and those problems will need new methods, but also they will need to be understood by the public. So I hope this is as good as you can do to represent complex diseases, but in there you have environmental, in the puzzle, you have environmental, social, biological factor. So I hope you're not too dizzy, because we did 40,000 years in less than 1 hour. So, so what comes next? I mean, I'm going here on your website. This is not, but I just want to show that the question you are addressing, are of this complex. By the way, congratulations for the website. It's a very nice website. I think it shows very well what the school does, and I was very much impressed. But I mean, if you go through those, through what you're doing, all these are very complex problems, and they are modern problems. They will require development of new techniques, new designs, etc. But even if you do this, there will remain this fundamental question of how can the public understand what we're doing? And I'm almost done, but look at this slide. When people listen to smoking causes lung cancer, okay, what do they understand? And I've done some survey to make sure, but they don't understand. If I smoke, I get lung cancer. If I don't smoke, I don't get lung cancer. But this is not it. As you see here, if you smoke more than a pack per day, you have 10%, lifetime risk of getting. So out of 200 people, I took 200 because this was 0.5%. But if you're a smoker, put yourself in a group in which there will be, out of 220 will get smoked. But who? No one knows. And if you don't smoke, it's not that you won't get it, but in your group, there will be only one person. And this is for a very strong association. If you go in other type of association that we can read of every day in the press, like if you eat fish weekly, your risk of macular degeneration will be lower than if you don't eat fish. So, I mean, in my home, my wife brings fish every day, so we won't get macular degeneration. I shouldn't say that. But that's what a lot of people, the public understand that, because that's how we are developed to.
Presentation and for the grand rounds. If there are any questions, we have time to.
Sure. Sure.
So how was the smallpox, this thing that was not a vaccine, but this artificially induced smallpox? Like, I didn't think there was anything before Edward Jenner and cowpox and millipedes.
Mhm.
So what was the mechanism?
So how did they discover the mechanism?
Yeah, what was the mechanism? How did they
Ah.
explain that they did?
Yeah, they didn't. I mean, this was a folk practice, folk knowledge, then that came from societies in which the idea of reinforcing, the body's defense was something that was compatible, with their ways of thinking. So it's such a strong association, the fact that if you get inoculated, you actually develop immunization, and you won't get the disease again if you're exposed to the virus, or to the disease itself. It's such a strong phenomenon that you can observe it without needing epidemiology. You can observe it, and so it's been observed in different societies. Like Lady Montagu found it in Turkey. But in Asia, they were using it also for several centuries, and they actually inhaled. It was not inoculated. And in Asia, there was a subscarification in the arm of the young kids, and they were developing some vesicles during the following weeks and some fever. But then after that was it. And so the opposition of the traditional doctors in the UK was either based on religious principles, because the idea of preventing the occurrence of a disease was not something acceptable. It was kind of, as I said, defying providence, or it was that it just didn't fit in the main theoretical frame in which medicine evolved, which consisted in always trying to keep a balance between cold and warm, between the dry and the wet, etc. They had this whole equilibrium idea, and so if you were kind of injecting in the body this foreign product, you were actually unbalancing and moving away from a healthy state. And so theoretically, they could not understand why this would work. Yes, Frank.
Fred, thanks. It's a very good talk. It's always good to look at the evolution of knowledge, things we think everybody knew all the time, we didn't know for a long time. But just relative to smoking, my impression is that during the early days of the American Cancer Society, the leadership was very skeptical of any connection between smoking and lung cancer. And over 2 decades, it sort of evolved to the only carcinogen of any consequence was cigarettes. And we didn't have to worry about all those messy industrial chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
So the point of this observation is that there's a social dimension, even a moral panic associated with what people accept as scientific fact.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's something interesting about this, Frank, because the main hypothesis when they started these studies was actually that it was air pollution and that caused lung cancer. For obvious reason, you have to imagine that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were no roads, there were horses carried, transportation, there was manure everywhere, etc. And they had to transform our cities and our environment to actually put tars over all this, clean up and put tar, and it was smelling tar everywhere. And those cars, they had all these exhausts and they were smelling also, and people were convinced that this was bad for their health. And the other hypothesis was smoking, but smoking was considered as a good thing. A lot of people thought that smoking did a lot of good for their health. They smoked to get, calm and to treat some gastrointestinal problems and other things. And so the smoking hypothesis was really the second, and it came out to be the first rapidly. But the other one, the air pollution, was also correct, and it took much more time, to actually show that both hypotheses were correct for smoking. And at the beginning, you're right, the American Cancer Society was not in favor of the hypothesis. They actually designed their cohort study, the Hammond and Horn study, with 200,000 people, the largest. The British had 30,000. We would have 200,000, right? And in a couple of years, they had more cases than the British doctor study, and they found the same thing. And that was the moment in which, they started to look at this thing completely differently. And yeah, there was a question. Hi, Mimi.
For a wonderful talk, really fun and so interesting.
Thank you.
I just wanted to get your up-to-date comments on the news of the origin of AIDS. You're talking about the high-need populations and epidemics, and to have epidemiology, and yet it looks like the new study just published in Nature, you really had to go back to the individual and to the individual DNA of these microorganisms to really understand this epidemic. So I'm just sort of thinking about that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing that is true not only for AIDS and HIV, but for many other diseases like cholera, John Snow, or puerperal fever, etc. I mean, all these diseases in which the identification of the cause, epidemiology excelled. It excelled because we didn't know actually the direct cause. We had to, John Snow found that it was water, that polluted water, that caused cholera. But if we had known that there was actually a Vibrio there and that there was a bacteria involved, we wouldn't have needed him. And it's true for HIV. If we once we knew it was a virus, we didn't need to have etiologic epidemiology involved. Epidemiology was involved in evaluation of treatment, etc. So the latest developments are that the virus was here since 1971, etc., and it came to New York. But in 1981, when there was the first evidence of an epidemic, of an outbreak, it was Kaposi sarcoma. Yeah, that's so epidemiologists were totally thinking in terms of chronic disease, and so they looked into drugs, poppers. There was this famous case control study in Lancet that showed that it was probably those poppers, drugs that gay people were taking that caused the Kaposi sarcoma, which on many aspects was totally irrational, because there were women who having that, and heterosexual people. It was clearly, Asian. That was so. It was a wrong. It was actually confounded by a number of sexual partners. That was the real issue. But if you read the epi literature, then they were into all types of different hypotheses, but not the infectious one. And as long as you don't have the virus, only epidemiology and group comparison can tell you, it's infectious. You should look for the bug. That's where we had 2 years. It was that window was not, we missed it totally. It's really badly. The only good thing that epidemiologists did is that they actually identified the group of the population that were most at risk, but all epidemiologic work was totally missed the point. And it was only after the spring of 1983 when they reported that it was, HIV that the literature changes. So,
Constant evolution.
yes? Okay, very good question. I mean, the question is, what's the sociological origin of epidemiologists? That's and you're right. I mean, until the 1960s, most epidemiologists are doctors. Actually, epidemiologists consider as a domain, as a field of medicine. And even in the 1960s, there are debates in a very good journal, by the way, the American Journal of Public Health, that ask who is an epidemiologist. And there are all those people that say epidemiologist needs to have an MD, etc. And so it also means that there were very few women who were epidemiologists, because Janet Lane Claiborne was an MD. She was one of the rare, women MD in the UK at that time. But that's if you see all those people, that you saw from the 19th century and further, they were all doctors. But James Lind was also a doctor. But Jurin and Grant were not doctors. But after that, most of it. What changes is in the 60s, there is this new blood that comes into the discipline, a lot from, young people who want to do something that's useful for public health, and they move into epidemiology, and they are not attracted, to become MDs. And so that's where the sociologically, the profession starts to change. And now it has changed dramatically. But until 1960, most epidemiologists, not all of them are doctors.
I will tell you that it's later, because when I was applying to school, there were schools who would not accept me because, and I'm old enough that there were schools that wouldn't accept me because I didn't have an MD.
Absolutely.
That was in the 70s.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wonder if you could comment on the rise of popular epidemiology in the 70s and 80s, the involvement of communities in doing epidemiological research.
Okay, so my approach to this is really in the development of the main methods, when there have been qualitative changes in the techniques. But during the same times, there have been an extension and application of those techniques to a lot of different areas. And so the involvement of population, what do you mean by the involvement of populations? Because
community organizations in collecting data and analyzing data at the population scale
Mm-hmm.
for addressing issues of environmental injustices or other concerns. Even in the age movement, the role of activists in sort of challenging epidemiological models. So that's part category. Has that affected the field of epidemiology in any way?
Well, not that I can tell, I'm sure it must have in some ways, but not that I can tell in the sense of that it had an impact on the evolution of the methods and what has been taught, etc. in epi department. As far, it's maybe something I should look into more in detail. It's an interesting question. I have to say that right now it doesn't ring a bell. The only thing that I think was quite an achievement in terms of epidemiologic studies was in 1976 when they decided to start the Nurses' Health Study, and we had the September issue that was of AJPH that was dedicated to this, because in some ways the success of that study is largely due to the fact that the nurses made it their own study. They made it a study that had such an incredible follow-up, and retention for 40 years, and the quality of the data that was collected, the variety of data that was collected, from toenail to blood to everything. And frankly, this is the first time that I'm aware of an occupational group who has such a huge impact on knowledge, on scientific knowledge, because the knowledge that was derived from the Nurses' Health Study touches almost all domains of medicine. It had international, world impact, and not only for women. And so I think that in terms of methodology, the fact that a great epidemiologic study is not only measured by the skills of the epidemiologist, but by the commitment of the population that is involved in that study. I think that's one lesson that we can draw from. Maybe I'm vaguely responding to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, you discussed the important epidemiological method in history. So did you also discuss the possible new directions regarding epi method? Say, now we mentioned at individual level gene sequence data. So do you see in the future people will go to epidemiologists will go to more gene sequence data analysis, or do you say now, especially I'm doing so-called system science, say complex system modeling. So those modelers usually are from mathematics, engineering. So now they took the public health job. Either they were located either in epi department or environmental health department. Many of them asked me, so where should they stay in public health? So those system science models will be part of future epi method. So how do you see the future method in epidemiology?
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is that if I knew, I would be doing it. But I just have some ideas, and I think it's also, I have a strong belief that there are, generation aspect, and that young people have a very different view and understanding of all those issues that I may have. I had enough struggle, with what we've done so far, and the new generation, they just consider this as very simple. They move. So to answer your question, I mean, there are complex issues involved in many of the problems that we are trying to address now. What I'm seeing is that there is some limitations in the human brain to deal with complexity when it comes to actually demonstrate, that a complex theory is actually true. I mean, there is the number of options that we see historically that have been used by humans are relatively limited. I think we cannot go beyond the simple comparisons of groups when we want to actually test an association, and this is what's essentially epidemiology. Now, which group do you compare? how do you integrate all this information that is developed by, system science, by genetic research, by sociology, by how do you integrate all this understanding of how things work and are connected into a design that actually tests those hypotheses? This is what epidemiologists can do, and this is where creativity is needed, because all our designs have evolved across time to be adapted to the new question we are asking. So I'm sure there will be developments, but I don't think that all of a sudden we'll abandon the simple frame, when it comes for the testing part. The theoretical part, conceptual part can be very complex. We're good at that, But when it comes to testing, I think there will be an issue of identifying which group can be compared. I think that's our tool. That's the human tool to answer those questions. And this is the job of epidemiologists. And if your friends, they are interested in the concept or more in testing those hypotheses, that's, I think, what should decide, help them decide in which direction they want to do.
We have time for one more question. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Please stick around and enjoy some of the food for another, please.